Ladies and gentlemen, as per our declaration, keynote of this program is the role of poetry for establishing world peace. I heartily welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Elham Hossain, for his keynote presentation. Just I want to introduce Dr. Elham Hossain to our audience and participants also. Professor Dr. Elham Hossain, he is a professor by profession working in Dhaka City College. He has completed MPhil in colonial literature and achieved PhD in Nigerian novelist Chinua Achebe's novel. He is a renowned researcher and educationist in Bangladesh, working as a popular professor in English, Department of English, Dhaka City College. He is a leading African literature researcher in Bangladesh this time. He has a remarkable contribution in translation literature also. About 10 important research books have already been published by this notable author of Bangladesh. He has good name and fame in teaching area. Then I request Dr. Elham Hossain sir to present your keynote, please.
Thank you, Mr. A.K. Ajad, for your generous introduction. I'm really delighted to be with all these beautiful people. Good evening, everybody. I feel honored and privileged to be invited as a keynote speaker to the International Poetry Concert for World Peace organized by Bangiya Sahitya Darpan. I express my thanks and gratitude to Mr. A.K. Ajad and Mr. Debashish Bhattacharya for organizing such a timely and relevant concert. I express my thanks and gratitude to all the participants from different corners of the world who are writing poetry as a tool to voice humanity and peace. So, ladies and gentlemen, I like to speak on the role of poetry in establishing peace. Let me share a few words on the role of poetry in establishing peace. Actually, poetry is as old as humankind. Man was born with poetry in his heart, and man is born with poetry in his heart. So it is not merely a metrical composition, I believe. It is rather man's inherent disposition of creating a world far, far better than this mundane world. The world which is troubled with anarchy, which is troubled with deaths, disaster, and massacre. It is the light of his mind, that is the mind of the poet, with which he overcomes the darkness of ignorance, parochialism, and bigotry. It is the impetus which turns a man into an aesthete. It is the impulse that builds empathy, builds a bridge among diverse communities in terms of solidarity, fraternity, and equality. Again, it, in times, turns into a piercing voice against injustice, brutality, and inhumanity. Thus, poetry lives in man's heart as well as head. It lives in man's imagination as well as in action. Man works with poetry, and poetry makes man work. In this way, poetry turns into an inseparable ingredient of human existence. In this connection, I like to refer to John Keats, who wrote to his brother Tom in a letter in 1819. Quote, "The great beauty of poetry is that it makes everything, every place interesting." Unquote. At the same time, Keats was against the lurid engagement of poetry into political and social issues, and hence he further said, quote, "We hate poetry that has a palpable design upon us." Unquote. So many believe that poetry seems to grow worse as soon as it starts giving lecture on the issues we know. But we cannot deny the role of poetry in addressing political and social issues. This is the reason for which Victorian poet Matthew Arnold asserts poetry is the criticism of life. Under the condition fixed for such a criticism by the laws of poetic truth and poetic beauty. He further believes that poetry is an interpretation of life. And it has the power, he believes that it has the power to console, sustain, and form us. At the same time, it delights us too. Arnold goes so far that he has called it more than religion. According to Robert Frost, poetry displays the marriage between mind and emotions. In 19th century French poet Charles Baudelaire, in his Les Fleurs du Mal, that is the flowers of evil in English, brought about a radical change in the content of poetry by expressing the changing nature of beauty in modern industrializing Paris during the 19th century. In 19th and 20th century, poetry in the hands of the European colonizers turned into a weapon or apparatus which worked very recklessly to impose the white man's burden upon the natives of different corners of the world. And we know that Rudyard Kipling wrote a poem, White Man's Burden. And in that very poem, he advised the colonized people, especially the colonized people of this subcontinent, to take up the white man's burden. And many poets, many European poets, glorified Christianity, which was used as a tool of imperializing the world in the hands of the European imperialists or the colonizers. But when poetry came down to the hands of the persecuted or the oppressed people, it started roaring in the rays of resistance and self-consciousness. In this subcontinent, poems of Kazi Nazrul Islam turned into a volley of rebellion against the inhumanity and cruelty of the British Raj. Again, his poems promulgated the enunciation of egalitarianism and cosmopolitanism. Nigerian poet Gabriel Okara writes back the colonizers in his poems. In his poem, "You loved and loved and loved," he answers to the laughter of the colonizers at the differences of the African natives. Derek Walcott writes back the imperialist discourse in his poem, Lost Empire. Syrian poet Adonis, who, according to Edward Said, the most provocative and daring poet, Arab poet, believes that poetry does not change the world directly, but it can change the readers, and the readers can change the world. Ukrainian poetry and history traditionally go hand in hand. At present, when Kiev and many other places of Ukraine have been transformed into a slaughterhouse by the aggressive Russian forces, Ukrainian poetry truly feeling the pulse of the time of turbulence and disaster, as poetry typically does in all ages, has become bold enough to pronounce its stance against aggression and inhumanity. And we hope Ukrainian poets and literateurs like Serhiy Jadan, Oksana Jabuchko, Yuri Andrukovich, then Maria Matios, Irene Rozbudko, Alexander Mikhet, and Lena Kostenko will hopefully make the world readership feel what they are suffering from now. And the readers of the world, as Adonis believes, will of course bring about a revolutionary change and make our beloved planet a peaceful, habitable place where we, the diverse people, will live in solidarity, brotherhood, amity, and equality. Let poetry echo the voice of humanity. Let poetry echo the voice of love, and let poetry echo the voice of peace. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much for your kind presentation. You presented a nice keynote for us, and we would like to give a big thanks from Bangiya Sahitya Darpan, India and Bangladesh branch, for your presentation. Thank you, sir.